Good morning, everyone. Welcome to S Factor Labs. My name is Samuel Ray, also known as Dr. Sam, and this is Morning Boot Up, my solo session that I do. I used to do it weekly, but now I know it's been a couple of weeks since I've been able to record or release one of these. Things have been crazy, but in this segment, I take, I would say, roughly 20 to 50 minutes to just talk about a topic that's on my mind and or that has been, inspired by recent discussion or discourse and rumblings that I've seen around the internet, particularly the gaming and content creation spaces. And what I wanted to talk about today was difficulty in games. It's kind of an interesting discussion because I grew up playing a wide variety of game genres, and I got my start in playing games back in 1994, 1995. And the first game I ever played was Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on the Sega Genesis. I would play it with my father. I was Tails while he was Sonic. So I was the helper character who couldn't truly, die or lose rings by getting hit. So I got to get a feel for the game, being a help, not a hindrance. And then about a year later, Dad and I switched the roles. He let me play as Sonic and he would play as Tails. And back then, this was the Sega Genesis. This was before game saves was even a thing. So every time we played, we had to play from stage one, the very beginning of the game. But games at that time were designed to be very replayable, or at least a lot of them were. And one of the things that made Sonic so replayable was that the better you got at it, the better your gameplay experience got. It's a game that actually respected your time and rewarded that time and gaining of experience with more fun. And back then, video games were difficult. That was coming off the heels of the arcade era, where games had to be hard in order to, make players put more quarters in, because losing all your lives meant inserting more quarters in order to continue. So games started off very difficult. And then in the era of the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis era in the mid 90s, that's when video rental stores like Blockbuster, Family Video, and such were really thriving with their VHSs. And then they also got into game rentals. And game developers, the publishers started kind of putting mandates on the game developers to specifically make the games hard and near impossible to beat in one rental in 1 week. They wanted to make it as hard as possible to actually clear the game in the 1 week time because you paid for rentals week by week. Basically, the closest analog to that nowadays is Redbox. You rent a movie or a game for a week, and then you return it. And if you didn't, then you get an extra fee, or you could go back and re-rent it for a week. Another week, I mean. So they wanted to make the games so hard that it was difficult to beat them in 1 week, one rental period, to incentivize multiple rentals. So back then, games were just difficult. They were tough as nails. I mean, if you look at a lot of older game franchises, the Sonic games, I wouldn't say they were particularly difficult compared to other games around it. But if you look at the older Mario games, if you look at the Mega Man series, Castlevania, a lot of those games, what was that one? Contra, there was a lot of games back then that were tough as nails, so hard to beat, especially in one sitting or on your first playthrough. And that was the norm, or at least it was much more common back then, I've noticed, than it is now, which is why nowadays it seems like that legacy of really difficult games tends to come from a few select developers, one of those being From Software, who are known for the Dark Souls games. But before that, they were known for the Armored Core series, which they are reviving and bringing back in the form of Armored Core 6 in August. All of those games have been really difficult in different ways, but very difficult, right? Um, but not for the same reasons. There's no arcade machines, no quarter munching, no rentals to worry about really in the same way. They are difficult for the purpose of facilitating a rewarding experience that rewarding experience to give you that catharsis, that satisfaction when you finally overcome the tough challenge. And that is a very valid reason to do it, just logically and psychologically speaking. Obviously, it's not for everyone. And that's why Elden Ring was the first game from FromSoft to really reach widespread mainstream appeal. And the reason for that is because they took the Dark Souls formula and made it open world and a bit more non-linear so that players, if they hit a brick wall, they didn't have to bash their head against that brick wall until they overcame it, like in the previous, Dark Souls like games. They could go somewhere else, come back when they had different gear or better gear or had improved as a player, and clear the challenges that they couldn't beat before. The freedom to go and do something else made Elden Ring inherently more approachable to more types of people. Those who wanted to bash their head against the wall in the traditional Dark Souls way could, and they would have a rewarding experience doing that. But those who just didn't have the patience or fortitude for it could go to something else and come back when they're stronger or had different stuff. And that's fine too. That's also a valid way of playing it. And that's what made it so beloved to the point of winning Game of the Year, which I believe is a first for a From Software game. So difficulty has its place for sure. I think, and here's the thing, I've been seeing this discussion around difficulty recently because of the recent release of Final Fantasy 16, which is the first truly action game. Because like Final Fantasy 15, in the series, it was an action RPG. It was real time, but then you could kind of slow or pause the action to give commands to the characters to do stuff, use their skills and whatnot, or items. So it still had a little bit of that RPG feel to it. And Final Fantasy VII Remake did the same thing. Real time action, but then you could do the pause, the action, and give commands and use skills and stuff like that. And so they were action games, but they still held on to some of the traditional turn-based elements to an extent, being able to slow down the action or pause the action outright in order to give yourself more time to make decisions and give commands to all the party characters. But Final Fantasy 16 got rid of all of that. It's a pure real-time action game. They got the combat designer from the Devil May Cry series, which is one of the most well-known and one of the hallmarks of the action game, genre. Well, character action game. And so it, for one, the gameplay style change, the focus was heavily divisive among Final Fantasy fandom. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily in the Final Fantasy fandom. I've played a few games, I enjoy them enough, but I have not completed, I don't think, any of the Final Fantasy games I've ever actually played. Never. I'm not big on, personally, turn-based RPGs anymore. I used to enjoy them a lot more as a teenager, but now, as I've had different experiences in my life since then and my own preferences and personality has changed, I've changed, my preferences of what I enjoy in games has also changed. So turn-based games just don't keep my interest much anymore. But that's not the real point here. We've already had a discussion on gameplay and story and stuff with the Rick's fees in the podcast proper. But in this case, I think, because what I've seen with 16 is a lot of people saying the gameplay's fun and all, but it's just too easy. And when you do your first playthrough of the game, your only difficulty options are easy and normal. And a lot of people who are used to real-time action type games are feeling like normal mode is just too easy. and that they don't get to truly make use of what the game mechanics have to offer because the enemies go down too fast. And so it feels not satisfying to them, not rewarding. And then they have to play through the game once in order to unlock the hard mode, which feels like a more moderate challenge to them. And yeah, I can see the frustration in that, especially when hard mode is locked behind a full playthrough of a very long game, right? Because then it's like, in order to get the type of experience that those people want, they have to invest so much time into the game before they even get the chance to try out hard mode. And they don't even know if hard mode is truly going to be a challenge for them when normal mode is just super, baby easy for them. So yeah, it's a very valid frustration, I would say. And I think that's a case where in single player games, a lot of times more choices for the player, like difficulty choices or other mechanical tweaks that they can make to add more challenge, is just better. If it's a single player experience, why not just give the players the ability to play it how they want from the get-go? It's not going to impact the experience of any other players, right? And honestly speaking, the type of people who want to get angry about, other people being able to play the same single player game and have an easier time than they did, I suffered, so you have to suffer too. And it's just a selfish mindset. It's not an objectively viable or respectable, I should say, stance to take. It's a single player game. That's like speedrunners, the type of people who want to speed run the game on the highest difficulty, all that kind of stuff, the most handicaps, then trying to invalidate the experience of people who play it normally. That's just stupid. I'm just going to say it. That's just stupid. So give players, the hard mode from the start. Like when I jumped into, what was it? Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order back before I started streaming with any consistency. And honestly, I kind of wish I streamed the game because I loved that game. It was so fun. When I played my first playthrough, I played it on the hardest difficulty. I think it was like called Grandmaster difficulty or something like that. And because it was available to me from the start. And you know what? The game had some real tough challenge at times, but overall, it was just the right challenge for me. It was satisfying to play the full time, Part of me kind of wishes that I played it on normal first so that I could have replayed it on the hardest difficulty in content, stream or on YouTube, but that's kind of besides the point. The point is the hardest difficulty in that game was just right for me. It felt like my normal with a few points of particularly tough challenges that were then satisfying when I finally cleared them after several attempts. It was great. If that difficulty was locked to me, I don't know if I would have had the same kind of experience, in my first playthrough. I don't know if I would look back as fondly and say, man, that game was so fun, if it was just too easy. And I think a lot of people nowadays are so used to single player games being just a cakewalk, especially single player action adventure type games, being very railroady, kind of holding your hands through it, having a lot of flashy set pieces that have no actual mechanical depth or challenge. It's just, hold forward or follow the visual prompts to run and jump and climb and all that kind of stuff. But if you're moderately observant and you know which way to go by recognizing that in the visuals, which are usually designed to guide you in the direction you need to go, especially in linear single player action adventure games, then there's not much challenge to speak of. But a lot of people do games are supposed to be entertainment first and foremost, right? They're not supposed to feel like a second job. Most of us in the gaming audience are adults, right, with disposable income. The majority of the gaming audience are, I think, ages 18 to 35. So the vast majority of people who buy and play video games have a job. So after a tough day at a job, most people don't want to come home and then have a tough time in a game. They want to wind down. So I understand the majority not wanting their games to be tough as nails. That's very valid, very reasonable. And obviously some games should be, you know, every game should have a target audience. That's not to say they should ignore every other audience in order to single-mindedly pander to that one target audience, but every game should have a target audience to some extent. But I think in the bigger budget games like Final Fantasy 16 that are they still have their target audience and they still have a vision, so they're not trying to appeal to everyone and make an amorphous blob that has no personality and no identity. But I think that in order to, to appeal to more people, having just more options that tweak the difficulty isn't going to change the vision of the game that much, realistically speaking. It's not going to change the story. It's not going to change the combat that much, especially if you have the right options. Making a game, allowing the players to make a game harder for themselves, I don't think is ever really a bad thing. Now, certain types of games, like turn-based RPGs, for example, like the Final Fantasy series progenitors, the earlier entries in the franchise, harder difficulties usually just means higher numbers for enemies and lower numbers for the player. And that's not really that fun, because then it becomes a completely imbalanced mess, and the player either has something that's exploitable or they have to find exploits in order to overcome it. Or in the case of, what was it, Persona 5, I think I heard, where the harder difficulty makes enemies numbers a lot higher, but then, or all numbers higher, something like that. So basically everyone hits harder, but you also earn more resources and in-game currency and stuff like that. So if the rate at which you get to upgrade your characters is also faster, which makes it harder in the early game, but then way easier in the late game, and sooner too, faster. So yeah, no, turn-based games, that's hard to make difficulty properly tough. I honestly think, though, scaling the difficulty to the player is the ideal way to do it, because scalable difficulty, there's a chart out there about flow state or maximum enjoyment ratio, and it is at the midway point between the player's skill and the perceived difficulty. When you find that balance between difficulty and skill to the point where the player has to try, it's hard enough that the player actually has to try in order to succeed, but not so hard that they feel like they're beating their head against brick wall, that's when you hit maximum enjoyment for the vast majority of human beings in general, in any activity. And I think that holds true. It's, there's not everyone, the type of people who want that experience that's going to beat them down until they overcome are the minority. They just are the minority out there amongst the human race. So yeah, some games can be made to appeal to them, but they just have to realize those types of games are never going to be the biggest sellers. They are not going to reach the biggest audience. And that's how niches work, right? You cater to that niche, but you have to keep your budget in keeping with that. You have to keep your budget comparable. So you're going to make something for a smaller niche. You can't put as much budget into it and then expect to make that back and then make a profit. Just not how it works. Supply and demand, right? You supply something that the majority want and demand, then you're going to make more money and more profit. If you, obviously balance your budget to that. So for a big AAA game like Final Fantasy 16, yeah, you want to appeal to more people. And in this case, making more options so that more people can have a satisfying experience is actually beneficial to that. But I think difficulty, so a lot of people have a very narrow view of difficulty, right? They tend to villainize the other side. Well, that's the case in all arguments, where people tend to have a tendency to illogically and irrationally, my side good, opposite side bad. But I think the truth, honestly, is more clear cut than that, and it doesn't care for personal preference or subjectivity. And I think in this case, the truth is more options equals better for more people and will not detract from anyone's experience. Options are there because they're optional. If you don't want to use them, don't use them. Cater the experience to yourself and give other players the ability to do so as well. Never a bad thing. Never a bad thing. Just in general. Player freedom. But not freedom to break the experience or anything. And obviously the developers have to choose what can be tweaked and how. And 16 already has accessibility options for that. Like people who just do not have the biological capabilities or physical or mental capabilities to do things on fast reactions, they have options where during dodge or parry moments or whatever, counter moments, the game slows down and has a timing ring that closes in on the input that's on screen and stuff like that. You can turn that off if you don't want the game slowing down to make it easier to counter stuff. But if you're the type who just doesn't have the reactions or experience with action games, you can turn that on or leave it on or whatever it is. They already made efforts to try and allow people to cater the experience to them, but it seems like all of the options only made it easier and there were hardly any options to make it harder. And I think they catered too hard to one side, in an effort to make the game more approachable. But they also need to make the game more appealing to people on the opposite side of things, the high skill players who want a more challenging experience. Don't just pander to one. Give options to both, and you're just going to benefit. Give options to both and profit, put simply. So that was my thoughts on it. I think there was a lot of people arguing on the internet about how stupid one side is for wanting options to make it harder, or how stupid the other side is for wanting a baby easy experience. But in this case, it's absolutely a porque los dos. Why not both? You're a AAA developer, Square Enix. Just if you're going to give accessibility and approachability options for people who struggle with action games in the first game that is truly an action game in the franchise, which is understandable, do that. Go ahead and do that. But don't neglect the people who want the challenging experience. Give options to make the game harder than the normal difficulty on the first playthrough, instead of locking the hard mode behind a full playthrough of a very long game. Like if it's a short game, like an arcade style game or whatever, a shoot 'em up or something that can be beaten in a couple of hours once you do get a successful run, yeah, lock hard mode, higher difficulties behind that, because the gameplay experience isn't going to be 30 to 80 hours. But if you're going to have a game that's that long, do not lock difficulty options behind a full playthrough. That's just not respecting the player's time. And that's another topic for another day. Game design that respects the player's time. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I got to get to work. Everyone have a great day. Please leave your thoughts with me in the comments on YouTube. I want to hear your thoughts on this topic. Absolutely. And have some discussion there. And then if you're listening on podcast platforms in audio only form, well, it's always audio only form, but on audio podcast platforms, then feel free to leave me your thoughts in a review or on Twitter at S_factor_Sam, or with the hashtag counterpickpod, all together, one word. All right, I'm going to get on with the rest of my day. Hope you have a great day where you are in the world, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or night. And I will see you in the next upload. Later.